Welcome back to U.S. History lecture videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to talk about the Second New Deal. So our last lesson was about the First New Deal. Today we're going to explain the ways the Second New Deal addressed criticisms of the First New Deal and assess its impact overall. So we're continuing with 1930s time period during the Great Depression. So the Second New Deal was President Franklin Roosevelt's response to the critics of the First New Deal. The Second New Deal was implemented between 1935 and 1938. It expanded federal power and created lasting social programs. So we're going to talk about some of the criticisms of the First New Deal. So some of the First New Deal legislature, it received criticism from both sides. Conservatives said it's too radical and the government was giving too much power to help. The liberal side said that it didn't provide enough help. So the Supreme Court struck down elements of the First New Deal as unconstitutional or illegal. And so, kind of crazy to think about. The New Deal faced criticism from both sides. Well, it's doing too much. Nope, it's not doing enough. So some key critics of the first New Deal argued for several things. Okay, so this is a list of critics and what they argued for should be reformed. Dr. Francis Townsend proposed an expansive pension plan for the elderly. Father Charles Coughlin was a radio priest who argued for more radical reforms. Huey Long was a Louisiana senator who proposed the Share Our Wealth program. Upton Sinclair ran for California governor with the End Poverty in California platform. So these are all various critics of the New Deal, but for different reasons, right? Some believed that the New Deal should have done more. Some believed the New Deal gave the president or the national government too much power. So after Roosevelt was reelected for a second term of presidency, he unveiled the Second New Deal. This was aimed to address the valid criticisms, right? He kind of ignored the things that he didn't think made any sense for criticisms. It focused on creating a social safety net and protecting workers' rights. These programs, some of them lasted quite a while. So we're going to talk about several of them. The Banking Act of 1935 was the most significant revision of banking laws for about 20 years. It created a 7-member board of governors to oversee regional banks and gave the federal government more control over monetary policy. Again, some people didn't like that. Some people thought it would be helpful. It allowed lower interest rates to fund relief and the recovery programs. And reforming the banking system was important for economic recovery because errors or lack of regulation in the banking system is often part of what historians believed caused the Great Depression. The Works Progress Administration was the largest and most ambitious New Deal agency. It employed over 8 million Americans to build things like hospitals, schools, roads, and other public work projects. It also employed artists and writers. And this impacted both the economy and the American culture by providing work for 8 million people, and including artists, writers, and building long-term projects like hospitals, schools, and roads that were going to remain in American society long after the Great Depression. One of the most famous Second New Deal acts is Social Security. This was established in 1935 and created a safety net for vulnerable Americans. It provided a pension fund for retired workers. This is still in place today. And unemployment insurance, very important, didn't really exist before this time period. Aid for unwed mothers, the blind, the deaf, and the disabled. However, it excluded many women and African Americans due to occupation restrictions, like due to what your job restrictions were. Social Security was a huge shift in American policy, kind of creating like a national government funded, regulated pension in a way that didn't exist before this time. The National Labor Relations Act was signed into law in 1935. This focused on protecting workers' rights to unionize, bargain, and essentially regulate labor between employer and employee, or business owner and employee. All right, now Roosevelt's also attempted to add Supreme Justices to the court, which was met with some conflict. He proposed adding 1 justice for every sitting justice over 70 who refused to retire, and it was part of a plan to kind of pack the Supreme Court with people who would support him. It ultimately failed, but it may have influenced some of the court decisions, and people agreed to disagree on whether this was an appropriate response. The Supreme Court isn't doing what you want. Change who's in the Supreme Court. Some people feel like that's too much of a control tactic. Now, within the Great Depression, the New Deal did start to lift things. And as soon as the New Deal spending program and legislation started to let up, there was a bit of an economic downturn caused by a reduction in government spending. Unemployment rose back up by 5%, and industrial production declined by a third. This was sort of a test to see what would happen if the government stepped back from the economy a little bit. And with that dip, it led the president to embrace going into debt to spend to stimulate the economy. The Fair Labor Standards Act was signed into law in 1938, and this established a federal minimum wage and set a maximum work week. These are huge things that we take for granted today. A maximum standard work week, overtime pay if you work more than that, child labor laws to protect those under 16. This was the last major piece of New Deal legislation, and it definitely continues to impact workers today. The fact that there's a federal minimum wage in addition to state minimum wages, a maximum standard work week nationally, overtime pay, these were all things that people had to fight real hard for. And remember, it wasn't that long ago before this time period that people were, you could have a 6-year-old working in a factory making 5 cents an hour because there's no law against that. So how did all of these things impact the minority groups? Okay, women, they gained some employment but were often excluded from direct benefits. African Americans received some aid but faced discrimination in the implementation of these programs. So these federal or state programs that were put out were often run by people who were discriminatory and would go out of their way perhaps to not help minority groups and help white Americans instead. The Indian Reorganization Act aimed to reverse the assimilation policy, so this was a positive for Native Americans, coming really far too late. But just the beginning of the American government beginning to realize the destruction that they had caused to the Native American population. But all of these groups still face significant challenges and inequalities. So overall, the Second New Deal created lasting social programs and expanded the federal government's role in the economy. It strengthened the labor unions and workers' rights and helped pull the United States out of the Depression. And it really shifted American politics. We now expect the government to step in if the economy is tanking. We now expect the government to insure our bank accounts and bail out a bank if it's going to mean that people will lose millions and millions of dollars. But before the Great Depression, no, there was no government intervention and stepping in for those things. All right, that's it for today.